This Week in the Boardroom, brought to you by corporate board member and host NYSE Euronext, along with governance knowledge partner Paul Weiss and contributing partners National Investor Relations Institute and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.
Welcome to this edition of This Week in the Boardroom. I'm TK Kerstetter with corporate board member, and I'm joined by my co-host, Scott Cutler with the NYSE Euronext. And Scott, we have a great topic today. We're going to be talking about when board leadership makes a difference. And we have the perfect guest joining us today. Let me introduce Kay Koplovitz, who's the chairman of Liz Claiborne. She is also the founder of USA Network and of the Sci-Fi channel, for those of you that are fans of sci-fi. She is also the chairman and CEO of Koplovitz and Company, a media advisory and investment firm. Welcome, Kay.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Now, I know that in addition to Liz Claiborne, you serve on CA, you have served on Oracle, on Nabisco. You've got a lot of other boards that you serve on, so you've had the chance to have exposure to CEOs, probably good management styles and bad, but we're interested in the good. We want to know what the common thread is that sort of runs through the successful CEOs, and particularly as that relates to their relationship with the board.
Well, I've been asked this question on any number of times, as you can imagine, having been on boards for almost 25 years now, public boards. And I always put communication right at the top. Why do I do that? I do that because we make the assumption that we put people in the CEO post of companies, or their founders, like Larry Ellison is, of course, of the company, but also CEOs that come into the company. They have different challenges, and you assume that they have the right qualifications. They have the right analytics, they understand the industry, the right drivers of their revenue streams, et cetera, all the things that you would expect a CEO to know about the industry. But that CEO has to communicate clearly to every level of communication, whether that's a stakeholder, an employee, an investor, the street. You have to explain yourself clearly as to where you're going. If you want everyone in your company to be delivering against what your strategy is and the outcome that you're looking for. So communication, I think, is really right at the top of my list of how the most successful CEOs operate with their boards. They communicate openly and freely with their board members so that everything is on the table and open and transparent. And I think that is why I see the CEOs that are most successful with their boards.
When you think about the relationship between a CEO and a board, and you step back and look at that from a CEO's perspective, what are the keys that a CEO needs to know in terms of having a great relationship with the board?
Well, I always think that CEOs, and I was a CEO for 20-some years, so I understand how it feels to be the CEO and have a board. I think that you really need to look at your board members as colleagues, as people that you can get advice from, that you can get information to and fro in a free flow of communication. That's how they're resources for you. A CEO must look at their board members as resources. I think this has changed over time. I think when I first started out on board service, it was a little bit more up and down. You'd hear a lot of reports, you would vote on things, and there was not as much discussion about things. A lot of discussion in the back room maybe, but not as much discussion at the board meetings per se. I think today a successful CEO, to be successful with their board, has to be absolutely transparent, fully communicative, not reticent to bring forth especially problems and challenges that you have. They should all be on the table as soon as you recognize them as a CEO. Then the board members can respond to you in a very like manner, I think, because everybody feels it's an open conversation. I think it's very important.
So if you switch that around and now put your board hat on, what are the keys that a board member needs to know in terms of establishing a great relationship with the CEO?
Well, interesting. I think that each and every board member needs to have their own relationship with the CEO, because when we, as board members, when we look at who sits around the table, we try to get people with different qualifications sitting around the table, different backgrounds, different experience levels, because that rounds out the advice that the CEO can get. But it's important, I think, that each board member have their own interpersonal relationship with the CEO. Therefore, the CEO knows best who to call on, who to pick up the phone and get on the phone, talk about a certain issue that they think that particular member can really help them with. And so therefore, I think that that's a very important role of the board member, is to make sure that they have that open communication and that they foster it with the CEO. And not to form little, sometimes you've seen in corporations and board experiences that I've had over the past, there can be little groups of people forming on the board that have different agendas of it. And that doesn't help the communication. It really, really has to be open and transparent, to be free-flowing, to be productive, to really offer as a board member your true experience to the CEO, and openly so the other board members get to share in that. It's really very important.
Well, there's no question that CEO board relations are sort of like the unwritten skill set. You won't readily find it in job descriptions, but boy, I can't think of anything more important to include in there other than that skill set. So I have a question for both of you, okay, on this. And first of all, so much has changed with the role of the chairman, and we've seen that at companies where the CEO has had to step aside. So my first part of the question is, how has the role of chairman sort of evolved or changed? And as long as we're talking about that, I'm also curious to have your views on sort of the growing movement that says that those roles of CEO and chair should be split into two separate positions. So, Kay, since you're our guest, I'll start with you, and then I'll go to Scott.
Well, I think the role of the chairman has changed over the last couple of decades fairly dramatically. We went through that entire period of sort of the imperial CEO, chairman CEO, I think, where, star performers were thought they could do no wrong. And many performed exceedingly well, and that was our model. I think that with a lot of, challenges in the financial markets and, over the period of time going back to WorldCom and companies like that, I think that we realize that there is a value of having a chairman that is somewhat independent from the CEO. And so I think that I've come to believe that that is a very good pro-governance position to take. It doesn't work perhaps for every company, but I do find value in having separate roles between the chairman and the CEO. In today's environment, I think that CEOs of public companies have huge challenges with the public markets, with the transparency, with the boards of people commenting about everything that the company does. There's a lot of things to deal with besides actually running the trains on time in the company and developing the strategies and all the things that CEOs do. They have a lot more to pay attention to and are open a lot more to criticism and critique. And I think that having a separate chairman to run the board agenda, set the schedules, make sure the committees are properly seated, that they're the right people on the right committees within the corporation. Those are sort of governance issues that I think a chairman can do very well and allow the CEO to really concentrate, very specifically on the operation of the business. And then that communication between the CEO and the chairman is really an alliance that, it is also an interpersonal alliance that they cooperate on setting the agendas and the topics that need to be covered for the board meetings. I think that's really the way I think we should evolve in the future. I've come to believe that.
Scott, any?
So the question on whether they should be split. What's interesting is the SEC issued rules, as you recall, in 2010, which required companies to disclose whether or not they had actually separated the chair and CEO, and if not, disclose the reasons why and their rationale for the structure. There were similar provisions in Dodd-Frank rules. I think it would be my view that the board leadership decision is best left to the board. But I think the board does need to sit and look at the board structure and ask whether or not that split between chairman and CEO is appropriate. If you look at the S&P 500, I think there's only 40% that have a split role. But if you look at the trend over the last few years, there's certainly been a trend towards dividing that. And certainly even this week in the news, you've seen movement around that. Mm-hmm. I think there's also been movement beyond just the relationship between the chair and the CEO as this role of a lead independent director. And so I think you've seen a lot more focus placed on the lead independent director as well in terms of more responsibility.
Well, we've always been a fan of this show that one size doesn't fit all, so
right.
we need to be consistent in that sense. It's not unusual that a board wouldn't go to a sitting CEO who has the title and say, hey, all of a sudden we want you to split this. But it certainly makes sense when those opportunities present themselves, and it makes sense for the organization when a new CEO is coming in. It's the perfect opportunity to take advantage of something like that.
I think that's when you see it most often, when there's a new CEO coming in. But we all remember Disney, for example, when Michael Eisner was the chairman CEO of Disney, and they did split that role while he was sitting CEO, and that does happen occasionally, but it isn't, I don't think it's as common as when someone's newly coming into the role. I think I personally believe that every board has its own personality. Each board operates somewhat differently according to the members of the board, and I totally agree with you that kind of decision is up to the board to make. I wouldn't want to see it mandated, but I do. Just having been in different kinds of organizations and having experienced that, including the executive chairman that the British system has, I don't think that's for us either. I think that here in the United States, we are looking more towards, the leadership. The CEO is the leader of the company. The chairman is there as the head of the board, but just a member of the board, really, just another member of the board who happens to chair the committee meetings the board meetings and some of the committee meetings if they serve on them. And so there's really a sort of check and balance that I think is really important as we live in a more complex world today than we ever have lived in, I think.
Well, for sure, we shouldn't underestimate the importance of board leadership. However that happens, and I'm sure it happens sometimes with people just sitting on the board who end up being very good leaders and may not assume positions. So I know this isn't the end of us on this show talking about board leadership, but Kay, we do want to thank you for joining us. This has been a great little review of board leadership, and we'll have to invite you back again sometime. And that will conclude this edition of This Week in the Boardroom. We hope that you'll join us again next week when we'll take a look at another critical topic that will help make you a better board member and committee member. So we'll see you then.
Join us again next week for This Week in the Boardroom, brought to you by Corporate Board Member and host NYSE Euronext, along with Governance Knowledge Partner Paul Weiss and contributing partners National Investor Relations Institute and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.